Mhm. All right. So, greetings. Good afternoon to everyone out there. This is Tiffany coming through live in effect right here on the StreamYard. So, if you're watching from YouTube, make sure you subscribe to the channel. If you're watching from Facebook, make sure you share this video. So, today's topic we're gonna be dealing with a historical event that had took place on this particular day. On July the 27th of 1816. So this area was like a pathway area for those who were free African American slaves in a place in the state where it's known as today Florida. All right, and this area was called the Negro Fort. So I want to show you what the image of the Negro forts look like. Well, I'm gonna show you the landmark, okay, the historical landmark, and I'm gonna read the historical landmark to you guys. So let me show you guys what the historical landmark look like. All right. So right here, this is the historical landmark of what is called the Negro Fort, and it says Fort Gas was it Gaston? Yeah, Fort Gaston, built in 1814 by Lieutenant Colonel Edward Nichols, His Majesty Marines, as a rally point to encourage the Seminole Indians to ally themselves with England against the United States in the War of 1812. Abandoned after 1814, it was occupied by a band of free Negroes and was known by 1816 as the Negro Fort. Its location in Spanish Florida did not deter Major General Andrew Jackson from ordering its elimination as a threat to American commerce on the Apalachicola River. So, in the beginning, right, a historical mark, it was an area where the Seminole Indians was allying with those from England to fight against the United States, right? So they can have their territory back. But then it became abandoned. So the Negroes or the free slaves, right? The former slaves, they found it as a location to where they not only earned their freedom, but it was like a hidden spot for them to get away, so that way they won't have to go back into slavery. They can use that as a pathway to get out of the United States and go elsewhere, or get out of the South and go to different parts of different parts of the world, or different parts of the country. So that's what it was used for. But let's get into the historical facts about this, okay? Um so yeah, and I want to show you another image real fast. Hmm. All right, so here's another image right here. It says British Sport Magazine. See? There it goes. All right. Let's go ahead and let's get into the topic. So, if you can see my screen, it says Negro Fort, right? And you can find it right here on WikiOne. Now, and it says the date was July 27th of 1816. Negro Fort of Apalachicola Forest, Florida. All right, and it says Negro. As the result, it was destroyed. All captured slaves forced back into slavery. So let's read on how this came about. Now let's read this little introduction right here. It says the battle The Battle of Negro Fort, also called the Battle of Prospect Bluff or the Battle of African Fort, was a brief and destructive sledge of a fortification filled with fugitive slaves and Chickasaw by the United States and their Creek allies. On Prospect Bluff, overlooking the Apalachicola River, a settlement and fortification that Andrew Jackson and other Americans labeled Negro Forts existed for a brief period. It was built by the British in 1814 during the War of 1812 in a remote part of what was at the time Spanish Florida. Because remember, the Spain had took over Florida, right? So it was Spanish Florida, and that's why if you know today Florida is not only the official language is English, but the secondary language is also Spanish, and you will find a lot of Hispanics or Latino people that live out in Florida because Florida was a Spanish colony. So you're gonna find a lot of areas that's occupied by those of Latino and Hispanic descent because of that, due to that. All right, let's go back and read. And it says it is part of the Prospect Bluff historic sites in the Apalachicola National Forest, Franklin County, Florida. The term Negro Fort was coined by the Americans only after the British Army had departed Florida in the aftermath of the Treaty of Ghent in 1815. Its later residents were primarily blacks, either being free Negroes or fugitive slaves residing together with some Chickasaws. There were a significant number of fugitive slaves already in the area before the fort was built. And beginning in 1804, there was for several years a trading post operating in the settlement. The blacks having been slaves that worked on plantation knew how to plant and care for crops and also to care for domesticated animals, mostly cattle. So, as I mentioned before, that area was a location where the fugitive slaves would go. It's just like it was similar to the Underground Railroad, right? If you guys know about the Underground Railroad and where Harriet Tubman led the slaves to, that was a pathway for the slaves to get out of the plantation and go elsewhere to find their freedom. That was the same way with Negro Forts. It was the pathway. It was the area where the fugitive slaves would go and they would, hide from their slave masters or, just try to, or they would go and interact with the Chickasaw Indians, right, and the Seminoles, just so they won't have to go back on the plantation. And that was a way for them to find their freedom. Woo, Jesus. Okay, and it says when withdrawing in 1815, the local British commander, the Irishman Edward Nichols, intentionally left the full-armed fort in the hands of the blacks who had served alongside the British during the War of 1812 and paid off a group of colonial Marines who, along with their Creek allies, reside in and took part in the defense of the forts. Also, Nichols hoped the fort became a center of resistance to slavery near the southern border of the United States. The site was militarily significant, being a military fort, although without artillery training. The residents of the fort were ultimately unable to defend themselves from potential U.S. incursion. It is the largest and most well-known instance before the American Civil War in which armed black slaves resisted whites who sought to return them to slavery. A much smaller example was Fort Moses near St. Augustine. The fort was destroyed in 1816 at the command of General Andrew Jackson. The American forces used heated shot against the fort and ignite the powder magazine, blowing up the fort and killing over 270 people instantly. However, the area continued to attract escaped slaves until U.S. construction of Fort Gadsden in 1818. All right. So let's see if we can find out more information. Okay. So let's read further down. Right here. And it says, the Negro Fort, as it soon came to be called, became widely known among the inhabitants of the region. It offered a safe refuge to anyone who wished to flee from the United States, whether they be escaped slaves who were safe once they reached Spanish Florida, or Native Americans fleeing white American settlement on their lands. Now, let me say something. Go back to Kanye West's stupid ass statement about slavery was a choice. This is what the part that he did not study or understand. It wasn't that slavery was a choice. It was that slavery was forced upon people, and it was bringing about traumatic experience. So you had Negroes that rebelled or that were trying to run away from the plantation. Okay. And then you had those that stayed because they were traumatized, they were scared. But these are the ones that were rebellious, and they said, "The hell with this! I'm not gonna go for this shit. I'm finna find an outlet about this motherfucker." And Harriet Tubman happened to be one of them, right? And these individuals here happen to be those as well that escaped to Florida. So Florida was used as the outlet. So for those of you sitting up there listening to Kanye West, you need to go down study and verify some shit. Don't just listen to what a motherfucking celebrity who is mentally discombobulated telling you. Because if you just listen to that shit, then that goes to show you that you don't know how to think for yourself. And you don't know how to go back and verify information. Now let's continue. All right, so it says the pro-slavery press in the United States expressed outrage at the existence of Negro forts. This concern was published in the Savannah Journal. Check this out. Now check it out. Listen to what they had to say. They said it was not to be expected that an establishment so pernicious to the southern state, holding out a part of their population temptation to insubordination, would have been suffered to exist after the close of the War of 1812. In the course of last winter, several slaves from this neighborhood fled to that fort. Others have lately gone from Tennessee and the Mississippi Territory. How long shall this evil requiring immediate remedy be permitted to exist? So as you can see, those who were for slavery, right, they were not pleased with the fact that this fort that was abandoned for 3 years, or for 4 years rather, it was abandoned for 4 years. And now all of a sudden it's used as an outlet for fugitives to get away. And these people, instead of reaching out to the slave masters, right, and letting them know that they have fugitives, they allow these people to just go ahead and run away. And they play a part in that. So that's how the post-slavery press looked at it. They looked at it like it was unacceptable. This should be illegal. And those fugitives should go back to their slave plantation. And the ones that are holding these fugitives, right, just so they can have a hiding place, they need to be dealt with. That's the attitude they had at the time. Let's go ahead. Let's continue on. Now it says escaped slaves came from as far as Virginia, because you gotta remember, Virginia was one of the first colonies that had African descended people in number. So Virginia was one of the first colony where the African descended slaves were first brought to. One the first colonies. Now, and then it says the Apalachicola was true of other rivers of North Florida, was a base for raiders who attacked Georgia plantation, stealing anything portable and helping the slaves escape. To guard this portion of the U.S. border, right? In April 1816, the U.S. Army decided to build Fort Scott on the Flint River, a tributary of the Apalachicola, supplying the fort was challenging because transporting materials overland would have required traveling through unsettled wilderness. It says the obvious route to supply the fort was the river. Although technically this was Spanish territory, Spain had neither the resources nor the inclination to protect this remote area. Supplies going to or from the newly built Fort Scott would have to pass directly in front of the Negro Fort. The boats carrying supplies for the new fort, the Seminoles and General Pike, were escorted by gunboats sent from past Christian. All right. The defenders of the fort ambushed sailors gathering fresh water, killing three and capturing one who was subsequently buried alive. Only one escaped. When the U.S. boats attempted to pass the forts on April 27, they were fired upon. This event provided a casus belli for destroying Negro Fort. So check this out. And why did Andrew Jackson do that? Well, let's read along. And it says Jackson requested permission to attack and started preparation. 10 days later, Andrew Jackson ordered the Brigadier General Edmund P. Gaines at Fort Scott to destroy Negro Fort. The U.S. expedition included Creek Indians from Coweta, who were induced to join by the promise that they would get salvage rights to the fort if they helped in its capture. On July 27, 1816, following a series of skirmishes, the U.S. forces and their Creek allies launched an all-out attack under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Duncan Clinch, with support from a naval convoy commanded by Sailing Master Jarius Loomis. Secretary of State John Quincy Adams justified the attack and subsequent seizure of Spanish Florida by Andrew Jackson as national self-defense, a response to Spanish helplessness and British involvement in fomenting the Indian and Negro War. Adams produced a letter from a Georgia planter complaining about the brigand Negroes who made this neighborhood extremely dangerous to a population like ours. Southern leaders worried that the Haitian Revolution or parcel of Florida land occupied by a few hundred blacks could threaten the institution of slavery. And on July the 20th, Clinch and the Creek allies left Fort Scott to assault Negro Fort, but stopped short of firing range, realizing that artillery would be needed. So basically, Andrew Jackson put a stop to it and said, you know what? Destroy this area and let's take over Spanish Florida. And that's how Florida became part of the United States, because of Andrew Jackson. Because of Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams Florida became a part of the United States. At once upon a time, Florida was totally separated. It was a territory, just a territory that was claimed by the Spanish. But because the Spanish did not have enough power to keep control of that territory in that area, and because of that fort that was allowing the fugitives to go to that location, Andrew Jackson put a stop to it. John Quincy Adams put a stop to it. And they seized Florida. They took over Florida. Yep. So there's your history. And so let's see what else I'm gonna go to right here. Okay, Battle of Negro Fort. Check this out. Now I showed you guys this a little earlier, right? It says British Fort magazine. It is hard to imagine the horrible scene that greeted the first Americans to stand here on the morning of July 27 of 1816. The remains of 270 persons killed in the magazine explosion lay scattered about. They also found an arsenal of 10 cannons, 2,500 muskets, and over 150 barrels of black powder. Some original timbers from the Antigano magazine were uncovered here by excavations. So that area, again, that's the historical landmark. That little landmark area is where they had the battle. Is where they had the battle and where they fought right there, which ended up killing 270 people. But let's find out more. All right, so I'm gonna read right here. I'm gonna read these. Yeah, I'm gonna stop right here. All right, so let's read. A plague at the site of Negro Fort, marking the location of the powder magazine. The Battle of Negro Fort was the first major engagement of the Seminole Wars period and marked the beginning of General Andrew Jackson's conquest of Florida. 3 leaders of the fort had become with Nichols since departing from Pensacola. There were Garcian, 30, a carpenter, and former slave in Spanish Pensacola, valued at 750 peso. Prince, 26, a master carpenter, valued at 1,500 peso. And peso is dollars in the Latin culture. So in the Latin culture, they use a peso. So like when you go to places like Mexico, Argentina, Colombia, they use peso. So it's currency. It's the Spanish currency. Anyways, going back, where did I stop at? Okay, it says who had received wages and an officer's commission from the British in Pensacola. And Cyrus, 26, also a carpenter and literate. Prince may have been the military commander of the same name at the head of 90 free blacks brought from Havana to assist the Spanish defense in St. Augustine during the Patriot War of 1812. As the U.S. expedition drew near the fort on July 27, 1816, the black militiamen had already been deployed and began skirmishing with the column before regrouping back at their base. At the same time, the gunboats under Master Loomis moved upriver to a position for a siege bombardment. Negro Fort was occupied by about 330 people during the time of battle, and at least 200 were Maroons. Now, who were the Maroons? The Maroons are descendants of Africans in the Americas who formed settlements away from slavery. Maroons often mixed with indigenous people of Americas, eventually evolving into separate Creole cultures such as the Garufina and Muskogos. Armed with the 10 cannons and dozens of muskets, some were former Colonel Marines. All right, give me one moment, you guys. Okay, I'm back, you guys. I had to go take care of something real quick. All right. So, all right. Okay, I'm back, you guys. Okay, so where I left off before I had left, let me go back and read it again. I said, as the U.S. expedition drew near the forts on July 27, 1816, black militiamen had already been deployed and began skirmishing with the column before regrouping back at their base. At the same time, the gunboats, right, under Master Loomis moved up river to a position for a siege bombardment. Negro Fort was occupied by 330 people during the time of the battle. At least 2,000 were Maroons, right, armed with 10 cannons and dozens of muskets, right, and some were former Colonel Marines. All right, so we're gonna look into that about the colonial Marines. Sorry, I misread that. Colonial Marines, and they were accompanied by 30 or so Seminoles and Cheetah warriors under a chief. The remaining were women and children, the families of the black militia. Okay, so and then it goes on to say, before beginning an engagement, General Gaines first requests a surrender. Uh, Garcon, the leader of the fort, a former colonial marine, refused. Garcon told Gaines that he had orders from the British military to hold the post and at the same time raise the Union Jack a red flag to symbolize that no quarter would be given. The Americans considered the Negro Fort to be heavily defended. After they formed positions around the one side of the post, the Navy gunboats were ordered to start the bombardment. Then the defenders opened fire with their cannons, but they had no training and did not know how to handle artillery, and thus unable to utilize their artillery in any meaningful respect. It was daytime when Master Jarius Loomis ordered his gunners to open fire. After 5 to 9 rounds were fired to check the range, the first round of hot shot cannonball fired by Navy gunboat number 154 entered the fort's powder magazine. The ensuing explosion was massive and destroyed the entire fort. Almost every source states all but about 60 of the 334 occupants of the fort were instantly killed, and others died of their wounds shortly after, including many women and children. A more recent scholar says the number killed was probably no more than 40. The remainder having fled before the attack. The explosion was heard more than 100 miles away in Pensacola. Just afterward, the U.S. troops and the Creeks charged and captured the surviving defenders. Only 3 escaped injury. 2 of the 3, an Indian and a Negro, was executed at Jackson's order. And General Gaines later reported that the explosion was awful and the scene horrible beyond description. You cannot conceive nor I describe the horrors of the scene. In an instant, lifeless bodies were stretched upon the plain, buried in sand or rubbish, or suspended from the tops of the surrounding pines. Here lay an innocent babe, there a helpless mother on the one side, a sturdy warrior on the other, a bleeding squaw. Piles of bodies, large heaps of sand, broken glass, uh, accoutrements, etc., cover the site of the forts. Our first care on arriving at the scene of the destruction was to rescue and relieve the unfortunate beings who survived the explosion. And then check this out. It says Garkon, the black commander, and the Cheetah chief, among the few who survived, were handed over to the Creeks, who shot Garkon and scalped the chief. African American survivors were returned to slavery. There were no white casualties from the explosion. The Creeks salvaged 2,500 muskets, 50 carbines, 400 pistols, and 500 swords from the ruins of the forts, increasing their power in the region. The Seminoles, who had fought alongside the Black, were conversely weakened by the loss of their allies. The Creek participation in the attack increased tension between the two tribes. Seminole anger at the U.S. for the fort's destruction contribute to the breakout of the First Seminole War a year later. Spain protested the violation of its soil, but according to historian John K. Mahan, it lacked the power to do more. Now, let's stop right there. Here it is. You had one individual, right, who refused to turn himself over, who refused to surrender. He said, I'm not surrendering. I'm not going back to that plantation. Fuck y'all. That was his attitude. Fuck y'all. I am not going back to that plantation. If you're going to take me out, you might as well go ahead and do it right now because I'll be down. But then you had those Native American tribes who were supposed to be the allies to the Blacks that turned over and basically said, okay, you know what? The U.S. promised them that, hey, we're going to give you this. We're going to give you the weapons. We're going to give you all this other stuff. If you give us the captives, if you give us the fugitives, we'll give you anything that you want. So basically the Creek and the Cheetah say, okay, Cool, no problem. We'll turn them over. Hey, it's no problem. As a matter of fact, we'll kill some of them for you. And this is why you got some blacks as of today that don't want to ally with Native Americans because of this historical event. Okay? Because of what took place, especially with the Cheetahs, the Creeks, and how they surrender over to the Europeans and say, hey, well, no problem. We can do this. I will give them back to you. As a matter of fact, we can go ahead and start owning some slaves. And the Seminoles did the same thing too, but the Seminoles, they were a bit hesitant. They was like, well, nah, we don't want to participate in that. Nah. But yes, they owned slaves too, but they were much more allies to the blacks than all the rest of them. Do you see how deep the history gets? It gets that deep. So let's go ahead and look at the aftermath. And what was the aftermath? It says the largest group of survivors, including blacks from the surrounding plantation, who were not at the forts, took refuge further south in Angola. Some other refugees founded Nicholstown in the Bahamas. Garson was executed by firing squad because of his responsibility for the earlier killing of the watering party, and the Cheetah chief was handed over to the Creeks, who scalped him. Some survivors were taken prisoners and placed into slavery under the claim that Georgia slave owners had owned the ancestors of the prisoners. Nimatala, a leader of the Seminoles at Flawtown, was angered by the death of some of his people at Negro Fort, so he issued a warning to General Gaines that if any of his forces crossed the Flint River, they would be attacked and defeated. So here it is. You had someone that was a Seminole, right? That was angered by the death that took place at the Negro Fort, and told the general, hey, if any one of y'all cross this line right here, if I catch y'all asses over here on this Flint River, that's your ass. Your ass is mine. I'm taking your motherfucking ass out. No hesitation. So that was the attitude of the leader of the Seminoles. He's basically saying, look, I'm gonna take your ass out. I'm gonna take your peoples out. Because y'all done took my people out, so I gotta take your motherfucking people out. It's wartime over here. And then the threat provoked the general to send 250 men to arrest the chief in November of 1817. But a battle arose and it became an opening engagement of the First Seminole War. So the general got scared, right? The general got scared and he felt really threatened. He was like, okay, you know what? We're going to have to do something about this because now this motherfucker's over here threatening us. So I'm going to send 250 of my men over there to keep guard of that area and go get that motherfucker and arrest him and bring his ass back. But what he did not know, that he was leading himself into a war, and which is the War of the Seminole, the first war. Yeah, the Native Americans were fighting back at the Europeans, some of them, and the Seminoles happened to be one of them. They were fighting back. They weren't having that shit. And it says, anger over the destruction of the fort stimulated continued resistance during the First Seminole War. All right. And then we're going to look at the reference. Okay, no. Let's look for the reference. All right, so these are the references over here. If you want to look more information, you just look down the reference page. Forts at Prospect Bluff, right? And then you got the one, events at the Prospect Bluff on the Apalachicola River, 1808 to 1818. You got casualty, U.S. Navy and Marine Corps personnel killed and wounded in wars, conflicts, terrorist acts, and other hostile incidents archived. Okay, see, there we go, right there. Um, and then you also go under further reading. Rebels and runaway slave resistant in 19th century Florida, University of Illinois Press, right? And then you got the external link. The external link, which is USDA Forest Service, historic Fort Gladson, archaeology channel, retrieved February 22nd, 2018. North America's largest act of slave resistance is a 2015 lecture by Nathaniel Mullet. Let's see. Let's check this out. Okay, that's the website right there. All right, so I'm gonna play a little bit of this video real fast about the Black Seminoles. And the largest slave revolt in the U.S. Here we go.
All over this, you would think it would be box office gold because it's part Spartacus and part Braveheart and part Amistad and part Glory with a little bit of Dances with Wolves thrown in. A story decades long of oppression and freedom fighting. I don't understand why there hasn't been more attention to John Horse and the Black Seminoles, but hopefully we can correct this. John Horse and the Black Seminoles deserve to be remembered for a number of reasons. They created the largest haven in the U.S. South for runaway slaves. They led the largest slave revolt in U.S. history. They secured the only emancipation of rebellious slaves prior to the U.S. Civil War, and they formed the largest mass exodus of slaves across the United States, moving from the Florida Everglades through Indian Territory, what would become Oklahoma, eventually locating in Mexico, where they secured title to their own land. It's a remarkable story. It's overlooked not just by filmmakers, it's not well known in popular culture, and in fact, it's been overlooked by historians of slavery, if you can believe it. In the early 18th century, two groups in particular fled the colonial South into Spanish Florida, into the Everglades. One of these groups were Seminoles, who were migrating from the various colonies, just trying to avoid white encroachment, basically, trying to move someplace that white colonists weren't. And the other group was runaway slaves, people who were fleeing and trying to create a free life for themselves. Both were welcome in Florida. And in fact, the Spanish crown offered runaway slaves their freedom if they would defend the land for the crown, for the Spanish. So a mixed society emerged in the Everglades of intermarriage, family intermingling between these runaway slaves and the Seminoles. And in fact, the first legally sanctioned Black free town in the North American continent was in the Spanish Florida Everglades. After the American Revolution, people living in the southern states didn't really like living that close to a large armed population of former slaves, particularly when they were in league with the local Native American nation, the large armed group of free Seminoles. And they knew that their own slaves felt free to run away and be harbored by this group. They knew that they were welcomed. And so from George Washington's administration on, there was questions of what do we do about the problem of the Florida Everglades. In 1818, this was James Monroe's administration, General Andrew Jackson actually moved into Florida, invaded it, not authorized to do so. He was actually pursuing justice against those who'd attacked Fort Scott in Georgia, but he did it anyway. He went into Florida and claimed it for the United States. When he seized the peninsula, he took the opportunity to um, execute some of the people who opposed him and also to clean out some of the areas of former slaves and Seminoles because he felt that this would make it better for annexation. The United States then soon actually bought Florida from the Spanish. When Jackson became president, he decided to make sure that the Black Seminole communities were moved out by force. So he pursued this in his policy, his larger policy of Indian removal. This led to the Second Seminole War, which was 1835 to 1842, and became the largest and costliest of the so-called Indian Wars. Because the two communities were tied together, that is, the former slaves and the Seminoles, when the Seminoles were attacked in the Seminole War, this led to an uprising of the former slaves. In April of 1836, Black Seminoles and their Indian allies moved together to create what was the largest slave rebellion in U.S. history. This wasn't just a matter of runaway slaves. More than 385 plantation slaves ran away from their masters and joined the Black Seminoles, essentially in laying waste to the Florida sugar mills, which were some of the most valuable areas, plantations in the whole continent. One Seminole leader at the time was the leader Osceola, who is justly remembered by history. Another leader who rose up at this time was John Horse, who was ethnically a Black Seminole, and who would ultimately lead his people on a long and trying exodus for their freedom. In 1838, John Horse and the Black Seminoles agreed to stop fighting the U.S. government in exchange for moving to what was then considered to be Indian Territory, which is now today the state of Oklahoma, and for legal recognition of their freedom. So despite the fact many of them were runaway slaves, they would have the opportunity to start over again as free individuals. Once they moved from the Everglades to Indian Territory, however, they found that their freedom was under attack, both by whites and by other Native Americans. In 1848, a decade after they had made the agreement with the U.S. government, the U.S. Attorney General announced that the government never had the authority, the power to recognize their freedom. And in fact, they were still, those who had been slaves, still enslaved. This was like opening season on them, basically declaring that they were there for the picking. And so they did the only thing they could do. They fled once again. Without security in Indian Territory, Horse and his Seminole ally Coacuchi promptly went to Mexico, where slavery was already illegal and had been for a couple of decades. There, Horse became famous as a general in the Mexican army, and his people found a way to make a life. Once they relocated to Mexico, things changed. When slave catchers from the Republic of Texas went over the border to try to find the runaway slaves, now free men, they met resistance not only from the Black Seminoles, but also from the Mexicans and the Mexican army itself. Eventually, the Black Seminoles, led by Horse, gained legally recognized Mexican land, nacimiento. Why isn't this recognized today? Well, for one thing, historians tend to be historians of Native American history or historians of slavery, but there's not many that move among these subjects. And it's a bit confusing because you have both the issue of runaway slaves and the issue of Native Americans kind of blended together, so it seems to fall through the cracks. Tradition is that Nat Turner's rebellion is the big turning point in the history of slavery and slave revolt. That happened before the rebellion of Black.
All right. So as you can see, that's the information about how the whole First Seminole War took place in Florida, or what is now today known as Florida, and how the fugitives got to that area. So all right. So leave off with this closing thought. As you can see, America was built on the back of slavery. America was built on the profit of slavery. America became what is known today as the United States of America through wars, through casualties. That's how it became a nation that it is today. Because they will fight so many wars, they will have so many casualties. They were not only dealing with domestic wars, but international wars like Great Britain, for example. So America has been built on the principle of violence. So when you talk about peaceful nation, that's non-existent. You can't really have a peaceful nation inside your backyard when your country is built on the principle of destruction and violence, because now you influence your citizens to become violent. They carry on what is left over, and they do it amongst themselves or in their community, in their neighborhoods. So all those former weapons that was used in the military, guess what? It's out there on the streets. Just like all those drugs that was used in the pharmaceuticals, in the medical industries, it's out there on the streets. It's becoming illegal. So when they say it's illegal, it means that it's no longer in use and it cannot be used anymore. So when they say the weapons are illegal, right, mean that it's no longer in use and it cannot be used unless it's been authorized by the government. So anyways, you guys, with that being said, that concludes Daily Black History. And I thank you all for watching. So if you're watching from my YouTube channel, please make sure you subscribe and share and hit the notification bell whenever I come on. If you're watching from Facebook, make sure you share this video. And again, may peace and power elevation be to all of you. Remember, knowledge is valuable. Knowledge is essential. So please make sure you're able to go out there and do your own research and educate yourselves. All right. Thank you, guys. Until next time, peace, be safe, and be at peace. All right. And be at standstill. Stay focused. All right.